Well, let's see. I'd like to look at John's Gospel in chapter 1 today. I've been looking at John's Gospel recently, and the Gospel of John, Bible scholars tell us, was the last of the Gospels to be written, probably what they think is around 100 AD, after Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And one reason they think that, I suppose, is because it contains almost completely different information about Jesus. Different things are told, and he speaks in a little bit different way. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's more or less accounts of the things that Jesus did. And so, of course, John has that too. But John, what you have to ask yourself is, after these other Gospels had been in circulation, possibly for years, why would John sit down and write this additional account of Jesus' life? Evidently, he had something he wanted to convey about it that he felt like was in addition to what was in the other Gospels. And it's not that they're in competition or anything, but John has a point or a message. He wants to convey something to us about Jesus. And in fact, if you read the Gospel of John and look for this, you find out there are some particular themes or some particular ideas that are constant throughout this Gospel. Let me just read a little bit from chapter 1, and then I want to make some observations. Let's just say the first 14 verses or so. John's Gospel, chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. In Him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehendeth it not. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. The same came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came into his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he the power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word was made flesh, and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." Now in these first 14 verses, I think we find some of the keys to understand what the message that John's conveying to us. There's some things I just noticed as I'm reading this. Number one, right in the very beginning, the very first verse, where he says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, the Word was God." We know from what it says later, down in verse 14, when he says, "The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us," we know he's talking about Jesus. So we might think, why doesn't he just say Jesus? That's a good question. Well, this is one of the keys to understanding the way John writes. Now, he uses spiritual language or metaphoric language. It's like poetic language. He doesn't say things directly. Now, we in our cultural context, we don't necessarily speak that way or write that way. We're very direct. We just say what we mean. But that's not always the case with every other culture and with every other Bible writer. John in particular likes to use spiritual language or metaphorical language and say things that make the reader or the listener, it engages you, it makes you ponder, it makes you consider, it makes you have to engage yourself with what he's saying. Because when he says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God," you have to stop and think, well, what does he mean by that? When we say Word, we think of a little chunk of, we think of a little chunk like that. Word, word, word. These are words. But sometimes, in our Christian, environment, we say Word as in the Word of God, or the message that we preach. We say, well, and it's in the Bible too. They preached the Word of God. They went down to a certain city, preached the Word of God. But what does that mean exactly? What does it mean when they preach the Word of God? Well, we sometimes hold up the Bible and say, this is the Word of God, and that's right to say too. But in the first century, when we say they went and preached the Word of God, they didn't have a Bible necessarily. There were scrolls around, there were manuscripts, but when they went out and preached, they didn't have those things like we do today. We're really blessed and lucky to have, everybody can carry a Bible around, but they didn't have that physical book. They just had, what did they have? A message. They had some concepts, and they preached a message about Jesus. And this is more getting to the thought of what John is talking about. He could have even said that, though. But it's interesting that he uses this, in the Greek language, the word that's translated word here is a Greek word, logos. And that is also the word that's used when it says they went and preached the word of God. And for his readers and listeners, at least for his educated readers and listeners in John's day, that word was loaded with some additional meaning that we might not necessarily have, because in the first century, the culture in which John was moving was heavily influenced by the Greek philosophers. And they had a lot to say about this word logos. For instance, Plato wrote a lot about, and so when John used the word logos, he was possibly trying to key on an understanding that was in people's minds. And the way, for instance, the philosopher Plato used the word logos, it's like this, if I could describe it this way. If I say a word to you like triangle, in your conception, in your mind, you can imagine a triangle. But in this physical world, what you're imagining in your mind does not exist. You might say, well, look at a mountain. That's a triangle. Well, it's not really. It's an imperfect triangle. When kids draw mountains, they draw a little triangle. But, a real mountain is not a perfect triangle. And even if I draw one on the wall back here, it's not going to be perfect. My lines are not going to be perfectly straight. Even if I use a straight edge, there's going to be imperfections. Anything I try to do to... See, what am I doing? When I draw a triangle on the wall in this physical world, I am, in my mind, envisioning a perfect triangle. But I can't make a perfect... That perfection doesn't exist in the physical world. That's what the idea of the Logos is. Plato called that unseen, invisible perfection. He called that the Logos. The idea, the concept, the message, if you want to say it that way, that exists outside of this physical world. And so what John is saying here, first thing he's telling us here, right in the very beginning of this gospel, is he's telegraphing a message by saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And we know from reading later he's talking about Jesus. He's giving us a message that I, John, am going to be using spiritual language here. I'm going to be saying things that are going to force you to consider and think and open your heart to think about what it is that I'm saying. What he's saying about Jesus is here that Jesus is God's perfection. Jesus is the perfection of God, and everything in this physical world is imperfect. But God didn't just leave it that way. When he says the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, see, God didn't just leave it where perfection is in God's realm and everything here is imperfect. He sent His perfection into this world in the person of Jesus. That's what he's saying when he says the Word was made flesh. See, flesh is imperfect, and flesh is usually kind of has a negative connotation. We talk about the flesh, and it means something bad, but Jesus was made flesh. That's what we are. We're flesh. Our bodies are flesh. We know we're a spirit, but Jesus came into our world, is what he's saying. Jesus came into our experience. He came from that realm of perfection to bring God's life to us. And that's kind of what he says here too. He talks about the life of God. So the first key to understanding John's gospel is he's going to be using spiritual language. The second point he's making, or the main theme is, the second key to it is one of the main themes is Jesus comes into human life, or we could say our lives, and he comes to make a difference, make an impact. And what we're going to see in just a few minutes is he comes to change, to make changes. And the changes he comes to make are not out here in this physical world, but changes in here in this internal world, to change what's inside of us. And John tells us this over and over again in various ways about Jesus. And then finally, the third thing I want to point out about this is, he says it in this first chapter at least twice, our part in this program of God is to believe. Did you notice, like verse 12, look at that for a second. As many as received him. Well, that's us, by the way. Our claim to be Christians is just based on that one fact, as far as we're concerned, what we did. Like if somebody said, well, what makes you qualified to be a Christian? Well, really only one thing. I believe in Jesus. I trust in Jesus. That's the only thing. I can't point to my life and say, I'm a perfect example of how life ought to be lived. But you know what? I can point to Jesus and say, he's a perfect example. See, I'm flawed. I'm imperfect. I mean, hopefully getting better. It's like that triangle. Hopefully I'm drawing the triangle better. But see, I can't say that I'm not a Christian because I'm perfect, because I'm not perfect.